3 women quit in 48 hours. One left screaming, one left in an ambulance, and one just vanished. Sadie didn't care. She had $12 in her checking account and a landlord who liked to break thumbs. A house full of feral children didn't scare a woman who was starving. Her left sneaker squeaked against the Carrara marble. It was a high, pathetic sound, a sharp reminder of the taped-together sole scraping against flooring that cost more than her life insurance policy. Sadie stopped, shifting her plastic bucket to her other hand, and let the heavy oak front door click shut behind her. The Callahan estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress masquerading as architectural art. The air inside felt heavy, climate-controlled to a sterile perfection, yet it smelled faintly of ozone, expensive beeswax, and something sour, like curdled milk hidden behind a radiator. Sadie adjusted her grip on the industrial mop. The agency had sent her for a deep clean night shift. $300 in cash. She needed the money by tomorrow noon to keep her kneecaps intact. A sharp, hysterical sob shattered the quiet. From down the cavernous hallway, a woman in a tailored gray uniform came sprinting. Her hair was torn from its neat bun, her face streaked with mascara. She was clutching her right forearm, where a dark, wet stain was blooming through the cotton sleeve. Sadie flattened herself against the cold wall to let her pass. "Animals," the woman gasped, not looking at Sadie, her eyes wide with a panicked, vacant terror. "They're not kids. They're goddamn animals." The heavy front door opened and slammed shut again. The silence that followed rushed back in, thick and suffocating. Sadie didn't run. She didn't have the luxury of panic. Panic required energy, and Sadie had subsisted on half a stale bagel and black tea for the last 2 days. Her blood sugar was a flat line. Her lower back ached with a dull, rhythmic throb. She looked down at the smear of blood the fleeing Nanny had left on the floorboards. She sighed, unscrewing the cap on her bottle of heavy-duty bleach. "That's extra," she muttered to the empty hall. She followed the trail of chaos into the West Wing. The destruction was systematic. A 17th century Ming vase was reduced to powdered porcelain on a Persian rug. The silk wallpaper was smeared with something thick and dark that smelled distinctly of blackberry jam. Books were ripped from their bindings, their pages scattered like dead leaves across the mahogany furniture. Sadie put her bucket down. She pulled on her thick yellow rubber gloves. The snap of the latex was loud in the room. A shadow moved by the doorway. Then another, then a third. Sadie didn't jump. She turned her head slowly, her neck popping. They stood in a line. 3 boys, maybe 6 years old. They wore matching silk pajamas, though one had torn the sleeve entirely off his. They shared the same jet black hair, the same pale, sharp-angled faces, and the exact same dead, unblinking stares. These weren't children caught in a tantrum. They looked like miniature adults, cold and assessing. The one on the left, whose pajamas were missing a sleeve, was casually tossing a heavy brass bookend from hand to hand. The middle one had dried blood, presumably the Nanny's under his fingernails. The one on the right held a silver monogrammed lighter, his thumb flicking the flame on and off. Click, whoosh, click, whoosh. They waited for her to scream. They waited for her to drop her bucket and run, just like the others. Sadie looked at the lighter. Then she looked at the shattered vase. Her head pounded. The eviction notice taped to her apartment door flashed in her mind. "I'm not a nanny," Sadie said, her voice flat, carrying the raspy exhaustion of a woman who had worked 2 shifts at a laundromat before taking this gig. The middle one tilted his head. "We bite," he stated. His voice was gravelly for a child. "Congratulations," Sadie replied, picking up a heavy push broom. "I have a tetanus shot, and I have exactly 4 hours to get this floor clean before a supervisor checks my work, which means if you stand on this rug, you're getting swept up with the garbage." The boy with the lighter stopped flicking it. The flame died. He exchanged a look with the boy holding the bookend. This was a deviation in their script. The boy with the bookend raised his arm, preparing to hurl the solid brass weight directly at her head. Sadie didn't flinch. She pointed the wooden handle of the broom right at his chest. If you throw that, you're picking it up, and then you're picking up the glass. I'm too tired to play dodgeball with a toddler. We're not toddlers, the middle one hissed, stepping forward, his hands balling into fists. We're Callahans. My dad kills people. Good for him. Does he pay his maids on time? Sadie didn't wait for an answer. She sprayed a heavy dose of industrial cleaner directly onto the jam stain on the wall, the harsh chemical smell of ammonia instantly burning the air. Kitchen's closed for cleaning. Go be menaces somewhere else. Or grab a sponge. She turned her back to them. It was a stupid, dangerous thing to do in a house like this, but her exhaustion outweighed her self-preservation. She dropped to her knees and started scrubbing the floor. The harsh, rhythmic scratching of the bristles against the wood filled the room. For a long minute, she waited for the brass bookend to hit the back of her skull. She waited for the bite. Instead, there was a quiet shuffle of bare feet. When she finally glanced over her shoulder, the hallway was empty. Sadie closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath that tasted like chemical fumes, and went back to scrubbing the blood off the floor. By 5:30 a.m., the mansion felt like a tomb. Sadie's arms felt like lead weights. She had stripped the wallpaper of jam, swept up 3 shattered lamps, and mopped an ocean of spilled milk from the dining room floor. Her yellow gloves were stained gray, and her cheap gray uniform clung to her back with cold sweat. Her stomach gave a violent, hollow cramp. She leaned against the cold stainless steel of the kitchen island, pressing a hand to her abdomen. The hunger wasn't just a sensation anymore. It was a physical ache, a dizziness that made the edges of her vision blur. She opened the massive double-door commercial refrigerator. The cold air rushed out, hitting her flushed face. It was a monument to wealth and neglect. There were jars of beluga caviar, vacuum-sealed truffles, a crate of sparkling water imported from a specific glacier in Iceland, and 3 dozen bottles of champagne. But there was no bread, no milk, no leftovers. It was a fridge for people who only ate at restaurants or had private chefs cater every meal. Sadie dug deeper, pushing aside a wheel of brie that probably cost more than her rent. In the very back, hidden behind a jar of preserved lemons, she found a half-empty carton of brown eggs and a thick slab of butcher-cut bacon wrapped in waxed paper. In a bread box on the counter, she found half a loaf of sourdough that was slowly turning to stone. She turned on the massive 6-burner wolf range. It roared to life, a circle of heavy blue flame. Sadie found a cast-iron skillet that weighed as much as a cinder block and dropped it onto the fire. The metal began to heat, radiating a harsh, dry warmth into the sterile kitchen. She sliced the bacon thick, tossing it into the dry pan. The hiss was immediate and loud. Fat began to render, bubbling and popping, spitting tiny droplets of hot grease onto the stovetop. The smell hit the air heavy, salty, smoked hickory and pure fat. It was a blue-collar smell, completely at odds with the minimalist, million-dollar aesthetic of the kitchen. Sadie cracked 6 eggs into a bowl, whisking them violently with a fork. She sliced the stale sourdough and dropped it straight into the popping bacon grease, letting the bread soak up the fat to soften it. A floorboard creaked. Sadie didn't stop moving, flipping the bread with a pair of metal tongs. She felt the eyes on her back before she saw them. The 3 boys stood in the arched doorway of the kitchen. They looked slightly less menacing in the harsh fluorescent light of the early morning. They just looked small. Their pale faces were washed out, dark circles, bruising the skin under their eyes. The feral energy from the night before had burned down to a dull, shaky exhaustion. They stared at the stove. They stared at the sputtering fat, mesmerized by the violent noise and the overwhelming smell of salt and smoke. "What is that?" the middle one asked. His voice didn't have the gravelly edge this time. It just sounded dry. "Breakfast," Sadie said, pulling the fried bread out and tossing it onto 3 ceramic plates. She dumped the eggs directly into the remaining hot grease. They seized instantly, the edges curling and turning brown and crispy. "Chef doesn't make that," the one who had held the lighter said, taking a tentative step forward. "He makes spun sugar and organic oatmeal." "Chef isn't here," Sadie said flatly, "and I don't know how to spin sugar. I know how to fry things." She slid the crispy, grease-laden eggs onto the fried bread, topping each with 3 thick strips of bacon. She didn't garnish it. She didn't cut off the crusts. It was ugly, heavy, peasant food. She pushed the 3 plates across the marble island. Eat or starve, I don't care. She turned her back on them, taking her own plate to the far corner of the kitchen. She poured a cup of lukewarm, stale coffee from a carafe she'd found in the pantry, drinking it black. She watched them out of the corner of her eye. They approached the island like stray dogs approaching a strange porch. The one with the torn sleeve touched the hot plate, flinching slightly. He picked up a strip of bacon with his fingers and took a bite. The crunch echoed in the quiet kitchen. He didn't speak. He just picked up the entire piece of fried bread, grease dripping down his wrists, and took a massive bite. The yolk broke, running down his chin. The other 2 immediately followed suit. For the first time since Sadie had entered the house, there was no destruction. There was no plotting. There was only the primal, mechanical sound of chewing. They ate with a desperate, unrefined hunger, tearing at the bread, licking the grease off their fingers. They weren't monsters. Sadie took a sip of her bitter coffee, watching them wipe their mouths with the backs of their sleeves. They were just neglected, angry, starving kids living in a very expensive cage. When the middle one finished, he pushed his empty plate forward. He looked at Sadie, the coldness in his eyes replaced by a wary, confusing vulnerability. "There's no more," Sadie said bluntly. "You get 1 plate. Now go wash your hands. You're getting grease on the marble." He didn't throw a tantrum. He didn't threaten her with his father. He just stared at her for a long moment, then slipped off the high stool and walked toward the sink. The front door opened at exactly 6:15 a.m. It didn't swing open with the frantic rush of a fleeing nanny. It opened with a heavy, deliberate slowness, followed by the solid, authoritative thud of heavy boots on the hardwood. Gabriel Callahan brought the outside world in with him. The air in the house immediately shifted, growing colder, denser. The smell hit the kitchen before he did a harsh cocktail of damp wool, stale cigarette smoke, wet asphalt, and the distinct coppery tang of drying blood. He paused at the threshold of the kitchen, a shadow filling the frame. Gabriel was 34, but his eyes belonged to a man twice that age. His dark suit was ruined, the fabric torn at the shoulder, the tie entirely missing. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a dark purple bruise wrapping around the side of his neck. Rain dripped from his dark, overgrown hair, trailing down a jawline shadowed by 3 days of coarse stubble. Under his left arm, the heavy leather of a shoulder holster bulged conspicuously. He froze. His hand, bruised and split at the knuckles, instinctually drifted toward the lapel of his jacket. He had expected the usual morning wreckage. He expected the wailing of a terrified nanny, the sound of breaking glass, the chaotic screaming of his sons tearing the house apart while he dealt with the violence of his actual job. Instead, he found absolute, terrifying silence. His 3 sons were sitting at the kitchen island. They were covered in grease, their faces smudged, but they were silent. They were eating. And at the far end of the kitchen, leaning against the sink with a damp sponge in her hand, was a woman. She wore a faded gray uniform that hung off her slight frame. Her hair, the color of wet sand, was twisted up in a cheap plastic claw clip that was missing 3 teeth. She looked exhausted, her skin pale, dark shadows carving hollows under her eyes. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying, she was just staring at him with a look of profound, unimpressed fatigue. "Who the hell are you?" Gabriel's voice was a low rumble, rough with exhaustion and latent adrenaline. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms and ordered executions. Sadie didn't blink. Cleaning service, night shift. Gabriel stepped into the harsh light of the kitchen. He looked at his sons, Max, Leo, Finn. They looked back at him, then returned to licking the last of the bacon fat from their fingers. They hadn't thrown a single knife. They hadn't set anything on fire. He looked back at the maid. "Where is the nanny?" "She left around midnight," Sadie said, tossing the sponge into the sink. The wet slap made Gabriel twitch. She was screaming something about animals. Bled on the hallway rug, which, by the way, is an extra $50 for biohazard cleanup. I'm adding it to the invoice. Gabriel stared at her. He processed the words, but they felt absurd in his mouth. You're charging me for a blood stain. I clean dirt, Sadie said, crossing her arms over her chest. Blood is extra. If you want the jam off the silk wallpaper, that's another 20. Your kids threw a vase. I swept it up, but the rug needs professional extraction. Gabriel slowly lowered his hand from his jacket. The sheer audacity of the woman was disorienting. Women in his world fell into two categories: those who wanted his money enough to fake affection, and those who were paralyzed by his reputation. This woman looked at him like he was a leaky pipe she had been called to fix. They didn't attack you? Gabriel asked, nodding toward his sons. They threatened me with a bookend and a lighter, Sadie replied, picking up her plastic bucket. I told them I'd sweep them up with the trash. We came to an understanding. Now, if you'll excuse me, my shift ended 15 minutes ago, and if I miss the 6:30 bus, I have to walk 3 miles. She started to walk past him. Gabriel shifted, blocking the doorway. He was a wall of solid, bruised muscle, smelling of violence and cold rain. He looked down at her. Up close, he could see the faint tremor in her hands. She wasn't fearless. She was just running on fumes. I need a nanny, Gabriel said. It wasn't a request. Sadie let out a dry, humorless laugh. I don't raise sociopaths, Mr. Callahan. I scrub toilets. I'll pay you $5,000 a week. Sadie stopped. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the floor. $5,000. That was her rent for the year. That was groceries. That was the medical debt hanging over her neck. The number echoed in her empty stomach, ringing against her ribs. She looked up at Gabriel. He wasn't looking at her with desire or warmth. He was looking at her the way a drowning man looks at a piece of driftwood. He was a king of a criminal empire, and he was entirely powerless inside his own home. Sadie tightened her grip on the plastic handle of her bucket. 10,000, she heard herself say. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute terror seizing her chest. 10,000 a week. Cash. Paid every Friday morning. And if they bite me, I'm allowed to bite them back. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. The corner of his bruised mouth twitched, threatening a grim, fractured smile. Deal, he said, stepping aside to let her pass. I'll see you tomorrow at 6, Sadie. She didn't look back as she walked out the door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind her. But as she stood in the freezing rain waiting for the bus, the phantom smell of stale smoke and copper still clung to her clothes, heavier than the bleach. By day 4, the estate smelled differently. The sterile, ozone-heavy scent of expensive nothingness had been replaced by the sharp tang of Murphy's oil soap, roasting garlic, and the harsh metallic scent of wet wool drying over radiators. Sadie didn't mother the Callahan triplets. Mothering implied a softness she couldn't afford, and they didn't trust. She treated them like a squad of hostile recruits in a trench war. She established a perimeter. The kitchen, her bedroom in the servants' quarters, and the main hallway were neutral zones. The West Wing was theirs, but if they broke anything, they cleaned it. They tested her defenses constantly. On Tuesday, Finn left a dead, half-eaten crow on the center of her freshly made bed. He hid in the doorway with Leo and Max, waiting for the inevitable shriek. Sadie had walked in, carrying a basket of folded laundry. She looked at the bloody feathers on her cheap cotton duvet. She didn't drop the basket. Her heart gave a dull, exhausted thump, but her face remained rigid. She walked back to the kitchen, grabbed a black plastic trash bag and a pair of tongs. She walked past the boys without a word, scooped the carcass into the bag, and turned to them. Get a shovel, she ordered, her voice scraping like sandpaper. They blinked. Max, the ringleader, crossed his arms. No. Fine, Sadie said, stripping the soiled bedsheets. But you're burying it. You killed it, or you found it. Either way, it's a corpse. You don't leave bodies on beds. It's unhygienic and it's disrespectful. Front lawn. 10 minutes. Or I feed you plain oatmeal for a week." She hadn't yelled. She hadn't threatened them with their father. She simply gave them an ultimatum based on logistics. 10 minutes later, she watched from the kitchen window as 3 small boys in designer clothes awkwardly dug a hole in the pristine, manicured lawn under the drizzling rain. They were feral because they had no structure, only fear. Gabriel Callahan ruled through terror, and his enemies responded in kind. The boys had internalized it. Sadie introduced them to something completely alien, consequences without violence. The physical toll on Sadie, however, was immense. The bruises under her eyes deepened to a permanent bruised violet. Her hands were raw, the knuckles split from hot water and harsh detergents. But on Friday morning, at exactly 6 a.m., there was a thick manila envelope sitting on the kitchen island next to her coffee mug. She opened it. Banded stacks of $100 bills slid onto the marble. $10,000. Sadie stared at the money, her vision blurred, the edges of the green paper vibrating. She gripped the edge of the cold counter, her knees suddenly weak. It wasn't joy. It was the agonizing, physical deflation of a suffocating weight being lifted from her chest. It was rent. It was medical debt. It was food that wasn't stale. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her sternum to stop the sudden jagged sob building in her throat. A heavy footstep sounded behind her. Gabriel stood in the doorway. He looked marginally better than Monday. His suit was intact, his jaw shaved, though the dark purple shadow of the bruise still crept up his neck. The heavy scent of black coffee and gun oil preceded him. He watched her stare at the cash. "Count it." "I don't need to," Sadie said, her voice entirely devoid of the emotion tearing through her chest. She quickly shoved the money back into the envelope, hiding her trembling fingers. Gabriel moved into the room. He didn't walk, he stalked, occupying space with a heavy gravitational pull. He stopped at the island, looking at the fresh loaf of bread resting on a cutting board, the clean countertops, and finally at Sadie. "They buried a bird on my front lawn on Tuesday," he stated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. "The azaleas needed fertilizer," Sadie replied, not looking up as she poured him a cup of black coffee. She slid it across the marble. "He didn't touch it. Max said you made them scrub the grout in their bathroom with toothbrushes yesterday. They thought it would be funny to flood the sink with blue food coloring. I thought it would be funny to see them learn the value of elbow grease." Sadie finally looked at him. "Do you have a problem with my methods, Mr. Callahan?" Gabriel studied her. His eyes were cold, assessing the color of crushed slate. He was searching for the crack in her armor, the hesitation, the deferential fear he was accustomed to. He found a wall of exhausted, cynical pragmatism. "I ran a background check on you," Gabriel said, leaning his weight onto his hands against the island. The shoulder holster shifted under his jacket. Sadie Miller, 28. Eviction notices, a mountain of debt from a private clinic, and 3 fired jobs in the last 6 months for insubordination. Sadie's stomach twisted, a cold knot of dread pulling tight. "Congratulations. You know how to read a credit report. Do you want your money back?" "No," Gabriel said slowly, picking up the coffee mug. He took a sip. "I want to know why a woman who is drowning in debt doesn't try to steal the silverware. I want to know why a woman who gets fired for insubordination hasn't screamed at me once." "Because you're not my boss," Sadie said, wiping down a spotless counter just to keep her hands moving. "You're my landlord in this trench. I keep your kids alive and the house clean. You pay me enough to keep my kneecaps attached. We don't have a professional relationship, Mr. Callahan. We have a hostage negotiation that we both agreed to." Gabriel stopped with the mug halfway to his mouth. A genuine, startled silence stretched between them. The sheer, unvarnished audacity of the statement hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was a fractional movement, a ghost of a smirk that didn't reach his dead eyes. "A hostage negotiation," he repeated softly, the gravel in his voice smoothing out into something dangerously close to amusement. He set the mug down. "Make sure they eat vegetables today, Sadie. The real ones, not the ones fried in bacon grease." He turned and walked out. Sadie stood perfectly still until the heavy oak door clicked shut. Then she let out a long, shaky breath, her legs giving out just enough that she had to lean heavily against the counter. She clutched the manila envelope to her chest, the thick paper rough against her raw palms. She survived week 1, the illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining again. The house was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic drumming of water against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sadie was in the kitchen, chopping carrots. Max, Leo, and Finn were sitting at the massive dining table, forced into a tense silence as they worked through third-grade math workbooks Sadie had bought at a discount store. The shift in the atmosphere wasn't loud. It was a sudden, absolute drop in the ambient noise of the house. The low hum of the climate control system choked off. The subtle blue lights of the security panel by the hallway door blinked out, dying into black plastic. Sadie stopped chopping. The heavy chef's knife hovered over the cutting board. Poverty had taught her a specific type of situational awareness. You learn to read the silence in a rough neighborhood. You learn to feel the pressure drop before a fight broke out in the laundromat. This silence felt exactly like the breath before a scream. A faint, muffled click echoed from the east wing. The service entrance. Sadie set the knife down. Her hands were suddenly slick with cold sweat. She wiped them on her apron, her heart beginning a frantic, erratic hammering against her ribs. She moved silently toward the dining room. The boys were looking up. They felt it too. The feral instinct in them recognized the shift in the territory. Max's eyes were wide, darting toward the hallway. "Under the table," Sadie hissed, her voice barely a breath. But Leo started. "Now." Sadie didn't leave room for argument. Her tone brooked zero rebellion. It was the tone she used when the stove was hot. The boys scrambled under the heavy mahogany table, pulling their knees to their chests. Sadie moved past them, heading toward the kitchen. She needed a weapon. The knives were too light, too close quarters. She needed mass. She grabbed the massive cast-iron skillet from the stovetop. It weighed almost 10 pounds, the handle rough and cold in her grip. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the marble flooring of the main corridor. Not Gabriel's boots. These were tactical boots, moving with trained, silent precision. 2 sets. Sadie pressed herself flat against the wall just inside the kitchen archway, the heavy skillet raised by her ear. Her breathing was ragged, shallow gasps tearing at her throat. She closed her eyes, the metallic smell of fear rolling off her own skin, mixing with the scent of chopped carrots and rain. A shadow fell across the kitchen floor. A man stepped into the archway. He wore matte black tactical gear, his face obscured by a neoprene mask. He held a suppressed submachine gun, sweeping the barrel across the room. He didn't look like a mob enforcer. He looked like a mercenary. He saw the empty cutting board. He saw the abandoned math books in the adjacent room. He stepped fully into the kitchen, his back to the wall where Sadie was hiding. Sadie didn't think. Thought paralyzed. She moved entirely on the raw, desperate adrenaline of a cornered animal. She swung the cast-iron skillet with everything she had. She wasn't a fighter. Her form was terrible. Her footing slipped on the polished marble. But the sheer weight of the iron and the velocity of her terror compensated. The heavy pan connected solidly with the side of the mercenary's helmet. The sound was a sickening, hollow crack, followed by the sharp ring of vibrating metal. The man grunted, a short, stunned sound, and pitched sideways. He didn't go down completely, his combat training keeping him on his feet as he staggered, his gun swinging wildly toward her. Sadie didn't stop. She didn't retreat. She lunged forward, tackling his midsection. They went down together in a chaotic tangle of limbs. The cold marble slammed into her shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down her arm. The man thrashed, his elbow catching her sharply under the jaw. Sadie tasted copper. Her vision flashed white. The man was throwing her off, his massive hands reaching for her throat. "Run!" Sadie screamed, her voice tearing, hoping the boys heard her. She scrambled backward, kicking out blindly. Her worn sneaker caught the man in the kneecap. He cursed, dropping his weight to secure her. His hands locked around her neck. The pressure was instant, crushing. The smell of wet nylon and sweat filled her nose as her air supply was cut off. She clawed at his wrists, her torn fingernails slipping on the tactical fabric. The edges of her vision began to darken, tunneling in on the masked face above her. Crack, crack. Two sharp, deafening reports shattered the air in the kitchen. The pressure on Sadie's throat vanished instantly. The man above her went entirely rigid, a fine mist of crimson spraying across the white cabinets behind them. He collapsed sideways, hitting the floor like a sack of wet cement. Sadie rolled away, coughing violently, her hands clutching her bruised throat. She dragged herself backward until her back hit the base of the island, gasping for air that burned her lungs. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a second body fall in the hallway. Heavy, familiar boots stepped into the kitchen. Gabriel Callahan stood in the archway. His dark overcoat was soaked with rain. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying violence. In his right hand, a heavy pistol was still smoking, the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder instantly overpowering the scent of copper and sweat. He didn't look at the dead man on the floor. His eyes swept the room, immediately locking onto Sadie. She was sitting in a puddle of water and blood, her gray uniform torn at the shoulder, a dark bruise rapidly blossoming under her jaw. She was clutching her throat, shivering violently, her chest heaving. The cast iron skillet lay abandoned a few feet away. Gabriel lowered the gun. The feral, murderous energy in the room seemed to condense entirely around him. He moved toward her, his steps suddenly terrifyingly quiet. He stopped a foot away from her. He looked at the dead mercenary, noting the dented tactical helmet. He looked at the heavy iron pan. Then he looked down at Sadie. "Where are they?" Gabriel's voice was rough, completely stripped of its usual cold authority. It was a raw demand. Sadie forced herself to swallow, crying out at the pain in her throat. She pointed a shaky finger toward the dining room table. Gabriel didn't run, but he moved with a swift, predatory speed into the adjacent room. Sadie heard the scrape of chairs, and then, for the first time since she had met them, she heard Leo cry. It wasn't a tantrum. It was the terrified wail of a child. She closed her eyes, letting her head fall back against the wooden cabinets. The cold marble beneath her felt grounding. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by a deep, shuddering nausea. A few minutes later, the heavy boots returned. Gabriel stood over her again. He had left the boys in the pantry, the only fortified room in the house. He reached into his coat and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. He knelt down, the fabric of his trousers soaking up the water on the floor. He reached out, pressing the cloth gently against a small cut on Sadie's cheekbone that she hadn't even felt. She flinched, pulling back. Gabriel's hand stopped. He didn't force the contact. He stayed kneeling in the blood and water, looking at this tiny, exhausted woman who had just engaged a heavily armed mercenary with breakfast cookware. "The alarm was cut," Gabriel said, his voice a low, rough murmur. It wasn't an explanation. It was an acknowledgement of the breach in his armor. "I know," Sadie rasped, her voice sounding like crushed glass. It got quiet. Gabriel stared at her. The cold, dead slate of his eyes had shifted. He was looking at her the way he looked at his most trusted lieutenants. No, not like a lieutenant. He looked at her like she was an entirely new, unpredictable variable that had just rewritten the rules of his existence. "You didn't run," Gabriel said. It was an accusation, laced with a strange, dark reverence. "You had a clear path to the back door. You stayed. You fought him." Sadie looked at the dead man, then up at Gabriel. Her whole body ached. She was broke, she was bruised, and she was sitting in a puddle of blood in a house owned by a monster. But as she looked at the billionaire mafia boss kneeling before her, she realized something fundamental had shifted. He needed her, and for the first time in her life, Sadie had the upper hand. "I told you, Mr. Callahan," Sadie whispered, coughing slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, cynical exhaustion. They're my mess to clean up now. Nobody breaks my perimeter. Gabriel let out a breath that sounded like a ragged laugh. He reached out again, and this time, Sadie didn't flinch as he carefully wiped the blood from her face. The silence that settled over the kitchen wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the metallic scent of gunpowder, the iron smell of blood, and the sudden, undeniable gravity of a newly forged alliance. Thank you for watching. If you want to see what happens when Sadie demands a raise for hazard pay and how Gabriel handles the men who dared attack his home, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure you subscribe. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment, and ring the notification bell. See you in the next chapter.